Well, now I'd like to welcome Kristina Wyatt, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Deputy General Counsel of an extremely interesting company called Persefoni, which is a SaaS platform that helps companies measure and monitor their carbon emissions. So welcome, Kristina. Thanks for being here.
David, so nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So you have a very interesting career. You're now working at Persefoni, helping companies, but you're a lawyer. You've spent a lot of time at the SEC. Just tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and who you are.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. So I've been at Persefoni, a carbon accounting software company, for just over 2.5 years. I came in February of 2022. And I came from the SEC, where I was working on the climate disclosure proposal that's now become the climate disclosure rule. And I was there on a special assignment. I was asked to go join right after President Biden was elected. And, it took me about 3 seconds to decide to take that opportunity. Before that, I worked at the law firm of Latham & Watkins for over 10 years, doing commercial transactions initially, but eventually building their sustainability program and helping to build their ESG practice.
Terrific. Well, I know you have a little bit to tell us about Persefoni, so why don't you do that, and then I'll join you for some Q&A after that.
Okay, sounds great. Do you mind if I share some slides?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Tell me if you can. Okay, you should be able to see that.
There you go. Looks beautiful.
Okay, great. So I thought I might start with a little bit of background, just because not everybody is fully immersed in carbon accounting and climate as we are. So just a really quick whistle-stop tour. Companies have been under pressure to report on climate for a very long time, from a whole host of different stakeholders, as you can see here. But what we've seen over the last several years, and this really started at the time that I went to the SEC in 2021, was that we're moving from what had been quite a fragmented voluntary reporting landscape to a regulated one that's largely harmonized. And this is very important because investors were looking for more consistent, comparable, useful information about companies' climate-related financial risks, about their carbon emissions. And companies wanted to have some clarity as to what they ought to be reporting. So this move toward a more harmonized reporting landscape and a regulated one was really a positive one. And this just reflects some of the alphabet soup that's now been harmonized within the different reporting structures that have emerged over the course of the last 3 years or so. And the reporting frameworks that are really the leading ones are the US Securities and Exchange Commission, where I worked on the rules, the ISSB, that's the International Sustainability Standards Board. This is a new standards board that was formed by the IFRS Foundation, which is the global accounting standard setter, to help to develop a global baseline that countries could use when they adopt their own sustainability regulations and laws, all driving toward consistency. The EU has adopted its own corporate sustainability reporting directive, and California, not to be left out, has also adopted a couple of laws, SB 253 and SB 261, which regulate climate disclosures. Now, that all sounds quite fragmented, but it's actually quite a bit more harmonized, or better harmonized, than where we were during the alphabet soup days. All of these different frameworks, regulations, and standards look to the seminal frameworks of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the thing that helps companies to measure their greenhouse gas emissions. It's a carbon accounting framework, and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which tells companies, gives them a framework for thinking about how climate may manifest as financial risk, and gives them a framework for talking about those risks with their investors. The consolidation down to these two frameworks and the harmonization around them is extremely important, because we've gone from fragmentation to a common lane of travel. Now, just thinking about carbon accounting, what is carbon accounting? It's effectively moving from the barter system to a monetary system, but for carbon. So if we think back to the days when we had to try to compare whether my 5 bales of hay were equal to your 2 chickens, it was really hard to compare the two things. And the same thing has been the case in the world of carbon. It's very difficult to know whether my flight from New York to London is equivalent to your, or how it compares to your operating your building for a week. They're just different activities that are very difficult to rationalize. So the greenhouse gas protocol is the thing that gives structure to how we can think about our carbon emissions. It's the thing that came up with the well-known scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 are a company's direct emissions. Scope 2 are the emissions associated with the generation of electricity that a company purchases, and scope 3 are effectively everything else, a company's upstream and downstream emissions throughout its value chain. Now, how does this all work? It's basically pretty simple math. You take activities, an activity that a company engages in, you multiply by an appropriate emissions factor, and then you'll derive constituent gases. There are 6 constituent gases as defined by the Kyoto Protocol. And then ultimately, you also translate those into 1 unit of measure, which is carbon dioxide equivalent. So carbon dioxide equivalent becomes that standard unit of measure, just like a monetary currency would be. Now, you can see we've got these honeycomb slides that illustrate that the emissions sources in different industries will vary. And so we really want to focus on the sources of emissions that are most significant in each industry. And here are just some examples for different industries. Now, I'm going to talk for a minute about technology and how technology is really critical to enabling companies to measure and manage their greenhouse gas emissions. Everything that I've described is actually quite complicated. If you think about a company engaging in hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of activities, and having to match those activities up to appropriate emission factors, and there are thousands of emission factors because they become very specific based on your location and the activity you're engaged in. So having to do that matching and then rolling up to the appropriate organizational hierarchy that you're operating under, and also defining scopes 1, 2, and 3, all of that becomes very complicated. And up until a couple of years ago, that was done effectively by consultants using spreadsheets. And that created a difficult situation for companies because it was simply too expensive and too cumbersome to try to track all this data on spreadsheets. And it also didn't give companies the flexibility that they needed to be able to actually see their emissions, to understand their emissions, and to make decisions on the basis of their emissions. So technologies come in. It's sort of a perfect use case for SaaS software. The software can take a company's activities and translate them into their greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see an example of this on this slide, and then here as well. This gets down to the very granular level where we at Persefoni have mechanisms not just to show a company its emissions at a macro level where they can see where their most intensive sources of emissions are and work to reduce them, but even down to the micro level where auditors would be interested in having the minute details as to what activities the company's engaged in, what emission factor sources are used, what the actual emission factors are, and then what the calculations are. So a company might have, as I say, hundreds of thousands or even millions of lines of data, and they're all tracked in this software. Now, we also have other tools like Scope 3 data exchange. This is enormously important as we move from using estimates to try to get a sense of what our Scope 3 or our upstream and downstream emissions are, and start to get to a more granular level of reporting. If we think about the first category of Scope 3 emissions, that's purchased goods and services. And for purchased goods and services, historically what companies would do is to multiply the amount of their spend by emission factors, and they would come up with an estimate of what their emissions are, and that's perfectly fine. But when you start to get to the point of trying to actually address your emissions, to reduce your emissions, you really want to be able to have to work with your suppliers to help them to reduce their emissions, to benefit from your suppliers' emission reductions. That's really the best way to move toward your own targets. Otherwise, the only lever that you really have is to reduce your spend. And of course, that's not consistent with growth. So we have a free tool that companies can use to reach out to their suppliers and exchange data with their suppliers. And the free tool enables their suppliers to report their actual emissions up to the purchaser's level. And that's creating the kind of transparency that we simply didn't have a few years ago. And that's really going to drive the transition to a lower carbon economy. We also have tools that help companies to identify the levers that will make the most sense for them as they work toward decarbonizing. And that's all I have. I'll take this down, and happy to have a conversation with you, David.
Kristina, that was a very succinct and well presented deck. So thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that I most like about what you're describing, the industry that Persefoni is one of the leaders in, and this whole transition toward harmonized reporting, is that there's sort of a viral effect that happens. As you were describing how, if I'm going to manage my emissions, I really need to know what's happening with the buildings I work, my company employees work, the buildings I own, the factories of the companies that are supplying me with inputs to my products or services, et cetera. And so once one company starts doing it, it sort of makes it necessary for others to do it. Are you seeing that? Is that really in action what's going on now?
Yeah, and I mean, you're absolutely spot on, David. And that's really the heart of the thesis of our company, is that network effects inevitably will take shape as companies start to report and share their data with others. And this is why we created Persefoni Pro, the free tool that we have, because we're deeply committed to transparency and to scaling carbon accounting throughout the economy. And you're absolutely right that good reporting will beget more good reporting. And so we're absolutely starting to see those network effects take shape. And I think that over the course of the next several years, we'll see that explode even more.
I'm so glad you said that, because my personal thesis is that we're going to see faster climate action than most people realize, and partly because network effects are going to come into play in this and a number of other sectors of the climate technology and climate action arena. So talk a little bit about how companies are receiving this. What's the general mood? Are companies thinking, oh, damn, this is a pain in the neck? Or are they welcome? I mean, what's the general tone? Obviously, your customers are the ones that are proactively moving forward. But, even thinking beyond your own customer set, how would you characterize the state of businesses' attitude and tone right now?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I see it shifting. There was definitely a pushback by some companies against the regulatory developments that were proposed, say, a year ago. And now that we have California in place and the handwriting is on the wall that companies will need to report their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, we're seeing companies really engaging. And I will say that the release of our free tool has dramatically changed the landscape. We see a pretty remarkable uptick in engagement with our free tool. So that's been extremely well received. And we're seeing the increase in the uptake, the pace of increase accelerating.
So in some key ways, companies can get started without even paying you guys any money.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can also go on Persefoni.com and set up an account and start using Persefoni without even engaging with a person. So there's really no friction.
That's really cool. Well, talk a little. One of the other things that's really interesting about Persefoni is you're using AI, and I'd like you to just talk a little bit about that, because I also personally think that the use of AI in climate action is going to be greater than most believe. So I hope you're going to reinforce that opinion.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. So AI comes in a whole number of different ways. It can help us to identify the likely most significant sources of emissions. So when we think about helping companies to identify the activities that they're engaged in that will contribute to their footprint, AI contributes there. When there are gaps in data that need to be filled, the AI can identify those gaps and help to fill them. Where there are estimates that need to be made, again, AI can help to fill the gaps and help to make estimates. And of course, the more data we have, the more accurate those estimates are. And I also think that in the solutions space, we're going to see a rapid increase in available solutions driven by AI and other technologies that will help us as we move toward decarbonization. So right now we're very much at the point of reporting our emissions, but the really exciting thing will be when we really start to work toward decarbonizing, and AI will certainly play a role there.
Persefoni is clearly one of the leaders in this space, but there are a lot of companies in your industry, which is great. They're arising all over the world, companies that help other companies track and reduce their emissions. But is that industry itself doing a decent job of collaborating and coordinating? Because I would assume that's important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there's promise for collaboration. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, has created a network called the PACT network, which is designed to help companies to share data. So the ultimate goal would be for climate data, wherever it's produced through whichever software provider, to be able to share that data with anyone, regardless of who's provided it. So that's in the works, but I think we're not quite there yet. However, I think as I mentioned, the Scope 3 data exchange within the Persefoni platform is sort of a precursor to that, where it's really designed to help companies share data throughout their value chain so that we can ourselves catalyze those network effects.
Yeah, I love the network effects. I'm glad you keep mentioning them. What about how companies are feeling about what business benefit they get by doing this? Are your customers saying to them, kind of congratulating themselves so that they can give a good message to their own customers?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that regardless of where a customer starts, some customers come to us simply because they have regulatory requirements and they're going to have to get audited emissions data, and they know that they need to come to us in order to be able to report and pass audit. Some customers come to us because they've made commitments and they want to work toward measuring properly and working toward their commitments. Some come to us because their customers are asking them for this data or asking them to report to CDP, et cetera. So whatever the drivers are initially, we're seeing a strong movement toward customers using the tool to find and measure business value. And that's very exciting.
Yeah, that is really cool. And it seems to me that there is a growing demand on the part of consumers to get this kind of information about the companies whose products and services they use, which I certainly hope will grow. Well, where is this going next? I mean, you worked at the SEC, so one of the controversies is that some people say the SEC didn't go far enough in its requirements, and of course, it also is a multi-year implementation process. Do you personally think it was fast enough, and where do you think it goes next?
Yeah, I think as to the SEC, it's become somewhat irrelevant in that it's been supplanted by California, which has adopted SB 253, which will require companies to disclose their scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions starting in 2026 for 2025 numbers, moving on to scope 3 in 2027. So, the train has certainly left the station. California is going to pick up some 5,400 companies. It's got a broad reach. The regulations coming out of Europe, the CSRD, also have a very broad reach. They'll apply to some 50,000 companies within and outside of Europe. The ISSB standards are being adopted by more than 20 countries that account for more than 50% of global GDP. So the direction of travel is quite clear. The SEC will be in litigation for a while, and ultimately its rules will be important, but the rest of the world is certainly moving on in the regulatory space. And in terms of company action, we're going to see, I think, a continued explosion in availability of data and companies reporting and starting to take action, particularly as companies have made 2030 commitments and start to think about how they're going to actually meet their goals.
Yeah, now the SEC is getting pressure both because people believe they went too far or they didn't go far enough. So we'll see how that works out. But I'm reassured by your bigger picture analysis. So thank you. Kristina Wyatt of Persefoni, really great having this conversation with you here at Wall Street Green Digital. Our next session, so stick around, will be solving the invasive plant crisis while decarbonizing the supply chain with our guest, Sydney Rodman. So see you there.